Hey friends, recently I took this poll and I asked some of you what video topic you'd be most interested in. And at first I was pretty surprised at the poll results. The winner was, drum roll, speaking in tongues. But now that I think about it, I'm not really that shocked because speaking in tongues might be the most consistently controversial issue in the church, all current social issues aside. And it's definitely the most controversial spiritual gift, maybe prophecy a close second. Just how controversial is it? Well, listen, I'm not talking minor disagreements here. Like some people even call the legitimacy of someone else's faith into question over this. I'm not kidding. There are actually folks out there saying tongues mumbo jumbo is a demonic manifestation. But for most of us, I don't think we're quite at that level. I think our struggle with speaking in tongues is likely due to either A, we've seen some very poor examples of it, or B, we don't really understand the purpose of it. And from what I've seen, there are three common issues that people have with speaking in tongues. And those three common issues are, number one, it isn't for today. Number two, it's just weird. And number three, only with interpretation. So let's take a look at these. Number one, not for today. It's the perspective that's usually bundled with a bigger belief package that is called cessationism. It's this idea that some of the New Testament spiritual gifts don't really happen anymore. They've ceased for one reason or another. And one of their main arguments specific to tongues comes from this isolated reference to 1 Corinthians 13:10. It says, "When the perfect comes, the partial will pass away." And cessationists interpret that as the perfect equals the canon of Scripture. So they're saying that at least the more prophetic gifts have ceased because we now have everything that we need in the Bible. But this argument's just a mess. This reference to the perfect here isn't even talking about the Bible. The passage is actually very specific about what it means, and it explains it in context if you just read verses 8 through 12. It's saying that now we only speak, prophesy, and have knowledge in a partial sense, but one day will be made complete, and that will be when we stand before Jesus. When the perfect comes is talking about the day that we see Jesus face to face. And friends, if you're watching this video today, then that hasn't happened yet. And now I'm going to save a deep dive into cessationism and B.B. Warfield's counterfeit miracles or other John McCarthyisms for some other time. And most of you guys are like, thanks for sparing us. But I'll just leave you with this challenge. Can you find anywhere in Scripture that clearly says that the gifts have ceased? And if not, shouldn't we be more careful not to cheapen or discard the gifts that God gives? And this leads me to our second issue with speaking in tongues. Number two, it's weird. Another way to say this might be, this makes me uncomfortable. Now listen, if you feel this way, I actually get it. Anything that we don't understand can make us feel uncomfortable. But guys, we need a better and more biblical reason than this if we're going to write off an entire spiritual gift that's supported so well by the New Testament. And if we begin to make our comprehension a prerequisite to everything, then let me ask you, does faith even have any meaning at that point? We aren't exactly following a God who fits neatly into our little box. We aren't following a God who limits himself to my understanding. And if we think that anything that we can't understand is automatically invalid, then you're going to be left with something pretty small and insignificant. Discrediting the things that God says are legitimate because we're afraid of what other people think, or we're afraid of what we don't understand, will leave us with an anemic and passionless systematic religion. So if this is your main issue with speaking in tongues, then my much bigger question to you is this: in what ways might you be limiting God's work in your life to the confines of your own understanding? Now for our final issue with speaking in tongues. Number three, only with interpretation. So I probably hear this issue come up the most. And although this view doesn't toss speaking tongues out entirely, it does place enormous limitations on it being used in any other setting than your personal prayer closet. So as an example, a good friend of mine recently asked, "What do you think about Bethel's latest worship album?" By the way, I really enjoyed most of it. This friend went on to tell me that they had an issue with some of the spontaneous moments where people broke out singing in the Spirit or speaking in tongues because no one was interpreting what they were singing or saying. My response was, well, did anyone need to? They thought, yes, they did, because Paul said tongues require an interpretation in 1 Corinthians 14. My response, is Bethel's congregation dealing with the same issues that the Corinthians were when Paul wrote that correction? Let me break this down a bit. The entire idea of only with interpretation is based on a sentence that's written in Paul's instructions to the Corinthian church that says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at most 3 should speak, and then 1 at a time, and then someone has to interpret. Thus, tongues should never be spoken in public without there being an interpretation following them, right? But there's a problem with this idea in that it lacks the context of the letter's corrections. You see, the Corinthian epistles contain many pointed instructions that address a long list of specific issues. Now, you remember that 1 Corinthians is where we find that famous love chapter? It's chapter 13, and Paul says that if I speak in tongues of men or of angels, but I don't have love, then I'm nothing. He then goes on to tell the Corinthian church what love looks like. Why? Because love had gone missing in their community. And one of the ways that they were failing to show love and consideration was by being disruptive and interruptive in their worship services. Now, when you read the whole passage, you're also going to find that unruly usage of tongue speaking was not the only culprit here. I could give a few examples, but let's pick another controversial one. Women should be silent in the church. Yes, we're really going there. But this one's actually pretty simple to explain. You see, most women weren't as educated as men were in that time, in that place, and so they kept interrupting the teaching of the word to ask questions. So Paul calls for them to be silent in the assembly and to save their questions for a non-corporate setting. It'd be the equivalent of someone leading a meeting and saying, let's take those questions offline. But if you didn't know the context of that correction I just mentioned, you look at that one isolated verse and you'd think, wow, Paul was a total chauvinist. But Paul wasn't saying, be quiet forever and never speak in public again. That would actually contradict his earlier mention of when women prophesy in the public gatherings. You see, the motive behind Paul's instructions here is to bring order back into the assembly so that love, unity, knowledge, and holy reverence would be a mark of God's church in Corinth. And this is the context for Paul's instructions on speaking in tongues here too. So, before saying that tongues requires interpretation before it's heard in a public setting, we should ask ourselves a couple things. Has it been causing disorder or chaos? Is it loudly demanding everyone's attention or being used in a way that's rude or inconsiderate of what God is doing and the other people around you? Now, if the answer to these questions was yes, then I would use the correction that fits the situation. And I would say, hold on. Let's only have a couple folks practice this publicly, one at a time. And we're going to wait for an interpretation, because if we're using it for rude interruption, then we're missing the purpose of speaking in tongues, which is either for proclamation or for edification. But listen, if the answer to those questions above is no, then let me give you a loving warning. Do not fall into the trap of creating legalistic rules that exert control over others while reinforcing your personal preferences or your programmed liturgy. So in closing, I encourage you to search the scriptures for yourself in all of this. But as you do, I encourage you to look for a few things. Look for references to speaking in tongues as a human language, like we see in Acts 2:11. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. And then also look for references to speaking in tongues as an intimate and direct line of communication with God, like we see in 1 Corinthians 14:2. For if anyone speaks in a tongue, they don't speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He utters mysteries with his spirit. And in your study, also see if you can find what I believe the two purposes of speaking in tongues are. That is proclamation and edification. So these are my thoughts for today on speaking in tongues. I hope you enjoyed them, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts?